There are some things a man can't ever forget. And the look on that girl's face, right after she watched a part of herself die, that was one of them. Tom Delaney had seen that look before. He'd seen it in the dust-choked villages of a war nobody won, reflected in the eyes of men who'd lost everything. But he never expected to see it here. Not on his ranch, not at the end of a dirt road that the devil himself forgot to pave, in the middle of a brutal Arizona summer where the air itself felt like it was about to catch fire. She was on her knees in his driveway. Her dress was torn, not ripped by accident, but torn with purpose. Her hands were shaking so hard you could practically hear them rattling. Dirt and blood were caked on her skin, her hair plastered to her face from sweat and fear. She looked like she'd been running for 100 years, and her eyes, they were dead. Not the kind of dead where the heart stops beating, the kind of dead that happens when it keeps on beating, and beating, and beating, even when the soul inside is screaming for it to stop. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't even try to say her name. All she did was look up at this stranger, this mountain of a man silhouetted against the unforgiving sun, and whisper 5 words that would change everything. "Please," she begged, her voice like sandpaper and gravel. "No more pain." And that was enough. Now you have to understand, Tom Delaney wasn't the saving type. He was a ghost haunting his own life. He lived in a house that had forgotten the sound of laughter, behind a front gate he hadn't opened for another living soul in over 2 years. The world had broken him once, and he'd sworn he'd never give it the chance to do it again. But something in those 5 words, something in that dead-eyed stare, it kicked down a door inside his chest he thought he'd nailed shut for good. He didn't hesitate. He didn't say a word. He just walked straight toward her. And when he reached her, when he saw the fresh blood seeping through the dirt on her knees and the raw terror she couldn't hide anymore, he did something that no one in the county would have ever believed. Hell, he didn't believe it himself. He leaned down, scooped her up into his arms like she was made of nothing but glass and ash, turned his back on the cruel world that had chased her here, and carried her straight into his silent, forgotten house. No questions asked, no judgment given, no turning back. Because Tom Delaney knew one terrible truth better than most. Sometimes when you're praying for a hero, God doesn't send you a saint. He sends you someone who's already been to hell and knows the way out. And what happened next? Well, that's when the real storm finally hit. He didn't sleep that night. He just sat on his porch in a creaking wooden chair, a shotgun resting across his lap, and watched the desert pretend to be peaceful. The sky was filled with a billion cold, distant stars, and not a single one of them gave a damn about the mess that had just stumbled into his life. Inside, she lay curled on his worn-out couch, wrapped in his old army blanket, the one that still smelled faintly of campfire, gunpowder, and years he tried his best to forget. She hadn't said another word since that desperate whisper in the dirt. But Tom didn't need words. Not yet. He could read the story written in her bruises. He saw the marks on her wrists, the kind that don't come from a fall. He saw the shadow in her eyes, the kind a man leaves behind when he thinks no one is looking. For years, Tom Delaney had been an expert at keeping things out. He'd built walls around his land and even bigger ones around his heart. But that night, as he stood guard over a broken stranger, he felt something dangerous, something he hadn't felt in a long, long time, begin to crawl its way back inside. Hope, and that scared him more than any bullet ever had. The next morning the sun came up mean and angry, but she was still there. That was something. He made coffee, black as a sinner's soul, and scrambled some eggs that looked like they'd already lost a fight. He set a plate on the small table near the couch, but she didn't touch it. She just sat there, knees pulled up to her chin, a ghost haunting a house that already had plenty of its own. But when he brought her the mug of coffee, so hot it almost burned his hand, she took it. Her fingers trembled, and her eyes still wouldn't meet his. But she drank. A small victory, a tiny flicker of life in the darkness. Later that day, he went out to the barn to feed the horses. He left the front door wide open. A test. He didn't lock it. He didn't ask her to stay. He was giving her an escape, a way out. He figured by the time he got back, she'd be gone. Another ghost disappearing back into the desert heat. But when he walked back toward the house, his boots kicking up dust, she was still there. She was sitting on the floor, tracing the lines in the old wood planks with her fingertip, as if they were a map to somewhere safe. Tom stood in the doorway for a long minute, just watching her. And then for the first time since she'd arrived, she spoke again. Not a plea this time. A question. Just one word. Why? Her voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed in the silence of that house like a gunshot. Why help me? Why bring a stranger inside? Why risk whatever trouble is chasing me? He didn't have an easy answer. He didn't have an answer at all, really. But he looked at this broken girl, this survivor, and the words just came. Because, he said, his own voice rough from disuse, I've seen what real monsters look like, and you ain't one of them. She didn't cry, but he saw it, a tiny crack in the dam, a single, almost invisible loosening in the tight mask of her face. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and that's when he went to check the mail. That's when he found the letter. It was crumpled in his rusty mailbox at the end of the long driveway, like someone had shoved it in with angry hands. There was no return address, just a big official-looking sheriff's seal stamped across the back. His stomach tightened. He hadn't gotten a letter from the law in a decade. He tore it open right there, the morning sun already starting to cook the back of his neck. The words inside were short, cold, and sharp as a razor blade. It was a report filed by a man named Carl Benson. He claimed to be the girl's stepfather. The report said her name was Maya. It said she was mentally unstable, that she'd had an episode and run away from home. It said she was a danger to herself. It said in no uncertain terms that her loving family just wanted her back. Tom stared at the page, and a cold, familiar rage started to burn in his gut. He didn't need a photograph or a background check to know exactly what kind of man Carl Benson was. He'd known men like him his whole life, men who used words like unstable and episode to cover up the bruises, men who smiled at church on Sunday and ruled their homes with a closed fist the rest of the week. He looked up from the letter, back toward the house. Through the open door, he could see Maya. She was out by the chicken coop, barefoot in the dirt. One of the hens was eating from her hand, and for the first time, a small, fragile smile was touching her lips. It was like watching a frozen flower start to thaw. He folded the letter, the paper crinkling under the pressure of his grip. He walked back inside, his boots heavy on the wooden porch, and dropped it on the table without a word. Maya saw the official seal. She didn't have to read it. She didn't ask what it said. Her face went slack, the color draining from her cheeks until she was pale as a ghost. That tiny, precious smile vanished. The dead look was back in her eyes, colder and deeper than before. And then she whispered those same haunting words. Please, she choked out. No more pain. Tom didn't answer right away. He just walked over to the old wood-burning stove, struck a match and watched the kindling catch flame. He waited until the fire was roaring, a contained fury in the heart of his home. Then he turned to her, his face calm, his eyes like chips of granite. I'll handle it, he said. And what he did next, well, that's the part of the story they started calling a legend. But the legend, as it turns out, was just the beginning, because the truth was 100 times darker. That same afternoon, Tom loaded his old Ford pickup. He didn't pack a bag. He just cleaned his rifle, the one his father had given him, and placed it carefully in the rack behind his seat. He drove the 40 miles into the county seat, Mesa, with the windows down and the hot wind whipping through the cab. The folks at the sheriff's office said later that he walked in like a storm cloud that had learned to use a door. He wasn't loud. He wasn't angry. He was something far more terrifying. He was calm. He walked right up to the front desk, slapped the crumpled letter down, and asked to see Sheriff Brody. Sheriff Brody was a big man, soft in the middle, with a face that looked like it was always sweating, even in the cold. He swaggered out of his office, all folksy smiles and false authority. Well now, Tom, Brody said, leaning against the counter. Been a long time. To what do we owe the pleasure? Tom didn't smile back. I'm here about this, he said, tapping the letter. About the girl. Maya. Brody's eyes flickered, a little too quickly. Ah, yes, the Benson girl. Tragic situation. Her stepfather, Carl, is worried sick. Says she's not well in the head. She's not sick, Tom said, his voice low and even. She's scared. He then proceeded to lay it all out. He didn't yell, he just told the truth. He described the bruises, the torn dress, the dead look in her eyes, the brand. He told Brody that Maya was on his property, under his protection, and that if Carl Benson or anyone else tried to set one foot on his land, they'd need more than a pair of handcuffs to sort it out. The sheriff listened, his folksy smile slowly melting away. He shifted his weight, suddenly looking uncomfortable in his own office. Because when a man like Tom Delaney, a man who has seen the worst the world has to offer and survived, speaks with that kind of certainty, people listen, or at least they pretend to. Look, Tom, Brody said, trying to sound reasonable. Carl Benson is a pillar of this community, a respected businessman. You're making some serious accusations here. I'm not accusing, Tom said, leaning in just a fraction. I'm telling you, stay away from my ranch and keep that monster on a leash. He turned and walked out without another word, leaving a thick, heavy silence in his wake. He drove home feeling dusty, tired, but taller than he had in years. For the first time since he'd buried his family, he'd fought for someone. He'd stood between the darkness and a flickering light. When he pulled up to the house, Maya was waiting on the porch. She stood up, her hands twisting the fabric of her borrowed shirt, her eyes wide with a question she was too afraid to ask. Tom just looked at her, the setting sun casting long shadows behind him. You're safe now, he said. And for the first time, maybe ever, she looked like she actually believed it. But they were both wrong. So terribly wrong. Because they thought they were fighting a man, they had no idea they were about to go to war with an entire kingdom. After that day at the sheriff's office, something in the little house on the dusty road began to change. It wasn't a sudden flood of light, but more like a slow, stubborn dawn. Maya started to move differently. The constant flinch that had been her shadow began to fade. She stopped sleeping with her boots on, ready to run at a moment's notice. She started to live. She'd wake up early, the quietest person Tom had ever known, and feed the chickens before he'd even had his first cup of coffee. She learned how to mend a fence, how to clean a rifle until it gleamed, how to hang laundry so the relentless Arizona wind wouldn't twist it into knots. She was absorbing the rhythms of the ranch, letting them sink into her bones and chase out the fear. One morning, Tom was walking back from the barn when he heard it, a soft, quiet sound, like the humming of bees. He stopped listening. It was coming from the kitchen. It was Maya. She was humming. It wasn't a song he recognized, just a simple, wordless tune. It was the sound of a soul remembering it was allowed to feel peace. He didn't go inside right away. He just stood there in the doorway, hidden in the shadows, and let the sound wash over him. Of course, healing is never a straight line. There were bad days, nights when she'd wake up screaming from nightmares she could never explain. Other nights, he'd find her wide awake, sitting on the porch staring out into the oppressive darkness, as if expecting monsters to crawl out of it. One night, he found her kneeling in the very spot where he'd first seen her, barefoot in the cold dirt. He didn't ask her what was wrong. He just brought out his old army blanket, wrapped it around her shoulders, and sat beside her in silence until the first rays of sun promised them another day. But there was a new, unexpected twist happening inside Tom, too. He hadn't just saved her. She was saving him. Every meal they shared in silence, every small task she took upon herself, it was chipping away at the ice that had encased his heart for years. The house was no longer just a structure of wood and nails. It was becoming a home again. He was a man who had forgotten how to care about tomorrow, and suddenly he found himself fixing a leaky roof. Not for himself, but for her. He planted a small garden with tomatoes and peppers because he'd noticed she liked them. He wasn't just a ghost anymore. He was becoming a guardian. One afternoon, she was in the corral, attempting to gentle a young colt that had a mean streak. She'd been working with the horse for weeks, patient and calm. Tom was watching from the fence, amazed at her touch. Suddenly, she looked over at him, her face smudged with dirt, her hair a mess, and she smiled. A real smile. Not the fragile, hesitant thing he'd seen before. This one was bright and warm and full of life. It reached her eyes and made them shine. "Hey, cowboy," she called out, her voice clear and strong. He just nodded, a slow smile spreading across his own face. And in that moment, Tom Delaney realized this whole damn thing was never about a rescue. It was about a resurrection, for both of them. But you see, the thing about kingdoms built on secrets and fear, the king doesn't take kindly to peasants finding happiness. Carl Benson wasn't a man who forgave or forgot. He was a patient spider, and he had just started to spin his web. The confrontation at the sheriff's office wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the opening shot. It happened on a Tuesday. One of those days where the heat is so thick it feels like you're breathing water. Tom was out in the back pasture, checking the fence line where it bordered the desolate hills. He was a mile from the house when he heard it. Hoofbeats, fast. Too fast for a neighborly visit. His blood went cold. He dropped his tools and started running, his heart pounding against his ribs. He was a strong man, but the years weighed on him, and the house seemed a world away. By the time he crested the last hill and saw the ranch house, the dust had already settled. There was a man on a horse right in front of the porch. Young, cocky, dressed in expensive leather, he had a pistol holstered on his hip, and he wasn't trying to hide it. It wasn't Carl Benson. It was someone younger, meaner. Maya was standing on the porch holding one of Tom's old shotguns. Her knuckles were white, but she was holding it steady, pointed right at the man's chest. "I'm here for the girl," the young man sneered, his eyes filled with an arrogant cruelty that Tom recognized instantly. It was the look of a predator. Tom kept his distance, staying in the tree line, watching. He needed to see how this played out. "You need to leave," Maya said, her voice trembling but firm. "I don't think so," the man said, dismounting slowly. "My father wants you home, and my father always gets what he wants." My father. The words hit Tom like a physical blow. This wasn't just some hired hand. This was Carl Benson's own blood, his son. "She's not going anywhere." Tom's voice boomed from the trees. The young man spun around, startled. He hadn't seen Tom. His hand immediately went to the pistol on his hip. "Stay out of this, old man," he snarled. "This is family business." "You set one foot on that porch," Tom said, stepping out into the open, his hands empty but his presence more intimidating than any weapon. "And you'll learn what happens when you threaten my family." The word hung in the air between them. Family. The young man, Jake, hesitated for just a second. He looked from Tom's unyielding stare to the unwavering barrel of the shotgun in Maya's hands. He was cocky, but he wasn't stupid. He was outnumbered. He spat on the ground. "This isn't over," he snarled, climbing back onto his horse. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." He galloped away, leaving a cloud of angry dust behind him. Maya finally lowered the shotgun, her arms shaking from the adrenaline. Tom walked up onto the porch and stood beside her. She didn't say anything. She just turned, and before he could react, she wrapped her arms around his waist and buried her face in his chest. It wasn't a hug of fear, or even of gratitude. It was something else entirely, something quieter and stronger. "I wasn't afraid," she whispered into his shirt. "Not this time." And as Tom stood there holding her, the silence of his ranch finally broken, he realized the terrible truth. Jake Benson wasn't lying. They had no idea who they were dealing with, because that night, as they sat in the quiet kitchen, Maya finally told him everything. She pulled out the small, oilskin-wrapped package she'd kept hidden all this time. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't money. It was her mother's journal. And the story it told was 1,000 times worse than simple abuse. Carl Benson hadn't just married her mother. He'd devoured her life. He'd isolated her, controlled her, and bled her family's inheritance dry. But it was worse than that. The journal was filled with dates, names, and numbers. It detailed shady land deals where ranchers suddenly sold their property to Benson for pennies on the dollar after mysterious accidents. It talked about water rights being diverted, drying up neighboring farms while Benson's land flourished. And then there was the last entry. Her mother wrote about a man named Henderson, a neighbor who had refused to sell, who had threatened to go to the state authorities about the water. 2 days after that entry, Mr. Henderson was found dead at the bottom of a ravine. The sheriff, A younger, newly elected Sheriff Brody had ruled it an accidental death. A tragic fall. Her mother believed it was murder, and she had started gathering proof. The night Maya's mother died, there had been a fire, a small, contained fire in the study. The official report said it was an accident, a faulty lamp. Her mother had died of smoke inhalation, but Maya knew better. She had seen her stepfather, Carl, leaving the study just minutes before the smoke alarm went off, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. He thought the journal, the only evidence, had burned with her, but Maya had found it, tucked away in her mother's hope chest. And that's when she ran. She wasn't just running from a monster. She was running with the one thing that could destroy him. Tom sat there, the journal open on his kitchen table, the flickering lantern light casting shadows across the damning words. He had thought he was protecting a scared girl from a bully. He was wrong. He was harboring a witness to a murder, and the killer was the most powerful man in the county. A man who owned the law, who owned the land, and who would stop at nothing to bury his secrets. The visit from Jake wasn't a warning. It was a promise. They weren't just in danger anymore. They were being hunted. The very next day the war began. It didn't start with gunshots, it started with silence. Tom drove into town for supplies, a trip he made every 2 weeks. But this time, everything was different. At the feed store, the owner, a man he'd known for 20 years, suddenly couldn't look him in the eye. He mumbled that he was fresh out of the grain Tom always bought. A lie. Tom could see the sacks piled high in the back. At the grocery store, the woman at the counter, who usually chatted his ear off, charged him for his goods without a single word, her face pale and tight. People on the street, people who would normally give him a nod, now looked away, crossing to the other side as if he were carrying a plague. The word had gone out. Carl Benson had blacklisted him. Anyone who helped Tom Delaney, anyone who even spoke to him, would face the consequences. He was being isolated, cut off. They were turning his ranch into an island, and the water was rising fast. When he got back, the air of dread was so thick he could taste it. Maya was waiting for him, her face etched with worry. He didn't have to tell her what happened. She already knew. She'd grown up in the shadow of that man. She knew how his power worked. It was a poison that seeped into everything, turning neighbors into spies and friends into cowards. "He's trying to starve us out," she said, her voice flat. "He'll have to try harder than that," Tom grunted, unloading the meager supplies he'd managed to get. But that was just the beginning. A few nights later, they were woken by the frantic whinnying of the horses. Tom grabbed his rifle and was out the door in a second, Maya right behind him. The old barn, the one he'd built with his own 2 hands, was on fire. Flames were licking up the dry, weathered wood, hungry and fast. They worked like a well-oiled machine, their movements fueled by pure adrenaline. Tom used the water pump while Maya, without a hint of fear, ran into the smoke-filled barn again and again, leading the terrified horses out to the safety of the corral. She was no longer the broken girl who had collapsed in his driveway. She was a warrior. They managed to save the animals and most of the barn, but the message was crystal clear. We can reach you. We can touch you. Nowhere is safe. The next day, he found one of his cattle lying dead by the creek that ran through his property. The water downstream from his land was cloudy, an unnatural chemical sheen on the surface. Poison, a deliberate, cruel act of destruction. They were under siege. Every night they took turns on watch, sitting on the porch with the shotgun, scanning the oppressive darkness for any sign of movement. The ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a fortress, and there were only 2 soldiers defending it. Tom knew they couldn't last like this. Benson was a boa constrictor, slowly squeezing the life out of them. He needed help. But who could he trust? The law was bought and paid for. The town was paralyzed by fear. He felt a familiar despair creeping in, the same cold hopelessness that had been his only companion for years. He had failed to protect his first family. Now it seemed he was destined to fail this one too. He was sitting on the porch one night, the weight of the world on his shoulders, when Maya came out and sat beside him. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just looked up at the same cold, indifferent stars. "My mother used to say," she began, her voice soft, "that you can't fight a flood. You have to find higher ground." Tom just grunted. "There ain't no higher ground, kid. Benson owns the whole damn valley." Maybe, she said, turning to look at him, her eyes clear and steady in the moonlight. But he doesn't own the mountain. He stared at her, confused. You need a lawyer, Tom, she said. Not from here. Someone from Phoenix. Someone Benson can't buy, can't threaten. Someone who can take this journal to people who are bigger than Sheriff Brody, to the state, to the newspapers. He almost laughed. A lawyer. That was a world away from him. A world of money and suits he didn't understand and didn't trust. Lawyers cost money, Maya. Money we don't have. Do you have any friends? She asked, her gaze unwavering. Anyone from your old life? Before this? And that's when a name, a face, surfaced from the depths of his memory. A man he hadn't spoken to in 15 years. A man who owed him his life. A brilliant, cantankerous, semi-retired lawyer who had a reputation for taking on impossible fights just for the hell of it. Elias Vance. It was a long shot, a desperate Hail Mary pass into the darkness. But as he looked at Maya, at the unshakable faith in her eyes, he knew it was the only shot they had left. The next morning he drove to the next town over, to the only payphone that wasn't under the watchful eyes of Mesa. He fed the coins into the slot, his hands shaking slightly as he dialed the old forgotten number. He prayed that the man on the other end of the line would remember him. More than that, he prayed that the man would believe him, because if he didn't, the flood was going to drown them both. The voice that answered the phone was exactly as Tom remembered it. Rough, impatient, and sounding like it ran on a diet of whiskey and cigars. Vance, the voice barked. Elias, Tom said, his own voice tight. It's Tom Delaney. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. So long Tom thought he'd hung up. Then a low chuckle. Delaney, I'll be damned. I figured you were dead. Or worse, happy. Not even close, Tom said. I need your help. Everyone needs my help, Vance grumbled. What makes you so special? Afghanistan, 2005, the ridge outside Kandahar. You, me, and 3 other guys pinned down by sniper fire. You took a piece of shrapnel in the leg. I carried you 2 miles to the evac chopper. The grumbling on the other end stopped. The voice was softer now, all business. What do you need, Tom? Tom told him everything. He told him about Maya, about Carl Benson, the corrupt sheriff, the brand, the journal, the fire, the poison. He laid out the whole ugly story, expecting disbelief, or at least a healthy dose of cynicism. Instead, when he was finished, all Elias Vance said was, Damn, sounds like you kicked a hornet's nest the size of Texas. Something like that, Tom admitted. All right, Vance said. Don't talk to anyone. Don't trust anyone. Make a copy of that journal. Photograph every single page. Hide the original somewhere God himself couldn't find it. I'll be there in 2 days. And Tom? Yeah? Try not to get yourselves killed before I arrive. Hanging up the phone, Tom felt a sliver of hope, the first real hope he'd felt since this whole nightmare began. They weren't alone anymore. The mountain was coming to them. But 2 days can be a lifetime when you're living in a war zone. Carl Benson must have sensed that they were making a move, that the net was closing, because he decided to stop playing games. He decided to end it. The night before Elias was due to arrive, the real attack came. It wasn't a single man on a horse this time. It was a full-blown assault. 2 pickup trucks roared up the driveway, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. They screeched to a halt in a cloud of dust and 4 men piled out. One of them was Jake Benson, his face twisted in a hateful sneer. The other 3 were big, rough-looking men, the kind of thugs you hire when you don't want to get your own hands dirty. We're done talking, old man, Jake yelled, a tire iron gripped in his hand. Give us the girl and the book, and we might just let you live. Tom and Maya were already in position. They'd been expecting something like this. Tom was crouched behind the porch railing, his rifle steady. Maya was inside by the window, the shotgun in her hands. This is your last chance to walk away, Tom yelled back, his voice echoing in the night. Jake just laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. Get him, he shouted to his men. And then all hell broke loose. The 3 thugs charged the house. Tom fired a warning shot into the dirt at their feet, But they didn't even slow down. They were high on adrenaline and arrogance. One man lunged for the porch steps. Tom didn't shoot to kill. He was a soldier, not a murderer. He aimed for the man's leg, and his shot was true. The man went down with a scream of pain. But the other two were still coming. One of them smashed a window with his tire iron, trying to climb inside. That's when the window exploded outward in a deafening blast. It was Maya. She had fired the shotgun. She hadn't aimed at the man, but at the wall right next to him. The spray of buckshot shredded the wood, sending splinters flying like daggers. The thug screamed and fell back, clutching his face, which was peppered with tiny cuts. The third man, seeing his friends go down, lost his nerve. He turned and ran back toward the truck. Jake Benson stood there, stunned, the tire iron hanging uselessly at his side. He had expected a scared old man and a terrified girl. He had found two battle-hardened veterans defending their home. He looked at his father's empire crumbling at the hands of a washed-up rancher. He looked at the girl who was supposed to be his victim, now holding a smoking shotgun with eyes of pure ice. And he did something his father would never forgive him for. He panicked. He dropped the tire iron, scrambled into his truck, and sped away, leaving his wounded men behind. Silence fell over the ranch, broken only by the groans of the injured thug. The air smelled of gunpowder and fear. Tom and Maya stood on the porch, their weapons still raised, their hearts hammering in their chests. They had won the battle, but they both knew, with a sickening certainty, that this wasn't the end. A cornered rat like Carl Benson doesn't just give up. He gets more vicious. He gets more desperate. And next time, he wouldn't send his son to do his dirty work. Next time, the king would come himself. The next 48 hours were a blur of adrenaline and anxiety. Tom tied up the two wounded men and left them in the barn, patching up the one he'd shot in the leg. He wasn't a monster. He called the next county's sheriff's department from the payphone, reported a trespassing incident with injuries, and left an anonymous tip about where to find them. He knew Brody would cover it up, but it would at least get the thugs off his land. Back at the ranch, he and Maya worked tirelessly. They boarded up the broken window. They reinforced the doors. And most importantly, they prepared the evidence. Using an old digital camera, Maya painstakingly photographed every single page of her mother's journal. She then downloaded the images onto a small encrypted thumb drive. The original journal, the real prize, needed to be hidden. After much thought, Tom pried up a loose floorboard in his bedroom, a spot he hadn't looked at in years. Underneath was a small, dust-covered metal box. Inside was his late wife's wedding ring and his daughter's first lost tooth. With a heavy heart, he placed the journal inside, nestled it amongst his own ghosts, and nailed the floorboard back down. It was safe. When Elias Vance finally arrived, he didn't look like a savior. He was a short, round man in a rumpled suit, with a face like a bulldog and eyes that missed nothing. He pulled up in a beat-up sedan that looked like it had survived a war of its own. He got out, looked at the patched-up barn and the boarded window, and gave a low whistle. "Looks like I missed the party," he said by way of greeting. They sat at the kitchen table, the thumb drive lying between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. Elias listened intently as they recounted the attack, his expression grim. He looked at Maya, really looked at her, not as a victim, but as a survivor. "You're a brave kid," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Your mother would be proud." Tears welled in Maya's eyes, the first she had shed since arriving. But they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of relief. Elias laid out the plan. It was simple and dangerous. He would take the thumb drive to a contact he had at the state attorney general's office in Phoenix. Someone who hated corruption and couldn't be bought. Simultaneously, he'd leak the story, along with a few key photos from the journal, to a bulldog reporter he knew at the state's biggest newspaper. "We're going to hit him from two sides," Elias explained. "The law and the press. We'll create a firestorm so big not even a man like Benson can put it out. But," he added, his gaze turning serious, "it's going to be the most dangerous when he knows he's cornered. When the story breaks, he'll know he has nothing left to lose. And that's when he'll come for the original journal. That will be his only move left." "We'll be ready," Tom said, his voice a low growl. Elias nodded. "I know you will be." He stood up, pocketing the thumb drive. "I'll leave now. The story should hit the morning papers in 2 days. Be ready. Once it's out, the world will be watching. As they watched his car disappear down the long driveway, a strange sense of calm settled over the ranch. The waiting was over. The trap was set. All they had to do now was survive until the cavalry arrived. They spent the next day preparing, checking their weapons, securing the perimeter, talking. For the first time, they talked about everything. Tom told her about his wife and his own daughter, also named Maya, who had been taken by a fever when she was just 6 years old. He told her how their loss had hollowed him out, turning him into the ghost she'd first met. Maya, in turn, told him about her mother, about her kindness, her strength, and her secret fight against the monster she'd married. They were two broken people, brought together by violence and fate, who had somehow managed to piece each other back together, forming something new, something stronger, a family. On the morning the story was supposed to break, the air was still and heavy, the calm before the storm. Tom was on the porch cleaning his rifle when he saw the dust cloud on the horizon. It wasn't a single car, it was three, and leading the way was a big, black, expensive-looking truck. The kind a king would drive. "He's here," Tom said, his voice grim. Maya came to the door, the shotgun in her hands. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. The three vehicles pulled up and parked in a semicircle, blocking any chance of escape. Doors opened. Sheriff Brody got out of one car, looking sick to his stomach. Two of his deputies, looking equally reluctant, got out with him. And from the big black truck, a man emerged, Carl Benson. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. He looked like a senator, a CEO, a pillar of the community. But Tom saw him for what he was, a predator in a $1,000 suit. "Tom Delaney," Benson called out, his voice smooth and confident. "This has gone on long enough. My friend Sheriff Brody has a warrant to search your property for my unstable, runaway stepdaughter." He was using the law as his shield, his final, desperate gambit. "You're not setting one foot on this porch, Carl," Tom said, raising his rifle. Benson just chuckled. "Oh, I'm not here to set foot on your porch. I'm here to burn your house to the ground with you both inside it. But first," he said, his smile widening into a predatory grin, "you're going to give me my wife's little book of fairy tales." He thought he still had all the power. He thought he was in control. But then, over the distant hills, came another sound. A faint, rhythmic chopping. Thump, 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 thump. It grew louder and louder. Everyone looked up. Coming over the horizon were two news helicopters, their cameras pointed directly at the scene below. And behind them, a fleet of black SUVs with state government plates kicking up a massive trail of dust as they sped toward the ranch. Elias Vance's firestorm had arrived. Sheriff Brody's face went white as a sheet. The deputies looked at each other, their loyalty to their corrupt boss evaporating in an instant. Carl Benson stared, his mouth agape, his carefully constructed kingdom collapsing around him in real time. The look on his face was pure, unfiltered disbelief. The hunter had just realized he was the one in the trap. He snapped. The mask of civility fell away, revealing the rabid animal underneath. He pulled a small silver pistol from his jacket. "The journal!" he screamed, his voice cracking with rage, and pointed the gun directly at Maya. "Give it to me now!" Tom didn't hesitate. He didn't think. He reacted. He fired his rifle. The shot wasn't aimed at Benson's heart or his head. It was aimed at his hand. The pistol went flying, clattering onto the dirt. Benson howled in pain, clutching his shattered hand. In that same instant, the state police SUVs screeched to a halt. Doors flew open and a dozen heavily armed state troopers swarmed the property, their weapons trained on Benson, in a very terrified Sheriff Brody. A man in a crisp suit, flanked by two troopers, walked calmly toward the porch. He looked at Tom, then at Maya, then at the cowering Carl Benson. "Mr. Delaney?" "Maya," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I'm Agent Miller from the Attorney General's office. It's over. You're safe now." As the state troopers slapped handcuffs on a screaming, cursing Carl Benson and a trembling Sheriff Brody, Maya and Tom stood on the porch, their weapons lowered, watching the end of the nightmare. The war was over. They had won. The flood had come, but they had found their mountain, and together they had held the high ground. The aftermath was swift and decisive. With the evidence from the journal and Maya's brave testimony, the case against Carl Benson was airtight. He wasn't just a domestic abuser. He was a murderer, a thief, and a racketeer. The state attorney general threw the book at him. He would spend the rest of his miserable life in a maximum security prison. Sheriff Brody and the deputies who were on his payroll were arrested for corruption, obstruction of justice, and a dozen other charges. The town of Mesa was rocked by the scandal, but as the truth came out, the fear that had held them all hostage for so long finally broke. People started talking. Other victims of Benson's reign of terror came forward. It was a cleansing, a painful but necessary lancing of a wound that had festered for decades. The story became front-page news across the state. Tom Delaney, the reclusive war hero, and Maya, the girl who refused to be a victim, were hailed as heroes. But they didn't want parades or medals. They just wanted peace. Slowly, life on the ranch returned to a new kind of normal. The barn was rebuilt, stronger than before. The well was cleaned. The land began to heal, and so did its inhabitants. Maya stayed. The ranch was her home now. She enrolled in online college courses, studying to become a victim's advocate, determined to use her experience to help others trapped in the darkness. The ghost in her eyes was gone for good, replaced by a fierce, brilliant light. And Tom was reborn. The walls he had built around his heart came tumbling down. He started smiling again, laughing. He opened his front gate, not just for Elias Vance, who became a regular visitor, but for new friends from town who, now free from Benson's shadow, wanted to thank the man who had set them free. The silent, forgotten house was filled with the sounds of life once more. One evening, about a year later, Tom and Maya were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, painting the Arizona sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The air was cool and clean. The world was quiet. "Hey, cowboy," Maya said softly, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Yeah?" Tom answered, his voice content. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me, when no one else would." Tom wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. "I should be thanking you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was dead and buried. You brought me back to life." They sat there in comfortable silence, two broken souls who had found each other in the dirt and the dust, and had not just survived, but had learned to live again. They weren't a father and a daughter, not a landlord and a tenant. They were something more. They were family, the kind you choose, the kind you fight for. Their story is proof that sometimes the deepest scars can lead to the greatest strength. It's a reminder that even in the darkest night, a single stubborn light can be enough to start a new day. And it shows that you don't need a cape or a superpower to be a hero. Sometimes all you need is an open door, a steady hand, and the courage to stand up and say, "No more." If this story resonated with you, if you believe that even the most broken things can be made whole again, then do us a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories that matter. But before you go, let me ask you this. Have you ever been someone's higher ground, or has someone ever been yours? Share your story in the comments below, because in a world that can often feel dark and overwhelming, these are the stories that remind us of the light, and we could all use a little more of that. Thank you for listening.